After his release, there was no moment that felt complete, no sense of closure. People assume freedom fixes things. It doesn't. It only removes the walls. The years he lost didn't return. They stayed where they were, locked inside a version of him that no longer existed. He tried to explain what had happened, how green felt easier than resisting, how exhaustion changed his judgment. Some people listened, many didn't. The confession still followed him, not as a legal fact, as a story people remembered. False confessions make people uncomfortable. They challenge the idea that truth always wins, so they are quietly dismissed. The investigators involved continued working. The procedures were adjusted slightly. Forms updated. Nothing that looked like accountability. No one admitted the process had failed, because admitting that would mean admitting how easily it could happen again. He learned to live with the knowledge that the truth didn't save him. Compliance did. The system hadn't needed force. It hadn't needed threats. It only needed time. People like to believe that innocence is protection, that saying the truth is enough. But the truth doesn't always survive pressure. Sometimes it gets tired. Sometimes it agrees. He didn't confess because he was guilty. He confessed because he believed the situation was temporary, because he trusted that fairness would correct itself. It didn't. And by the time anyone questioned the story, the damage had already been done. The most dangerous part of the room wasn't the door. It was the idea that he was free to leave. He agreed to talk because he believed it would be quick. He believed it would be informal. Just a conversation. He wasn't arrested. He wasn't handcuffed. He walked into the room on his own. The door closed behind him, but it didn't lock. At least, not at first. He had never been in trouble before. No record. No history. That mattered to him. It made him feel protected. People like him don't get accused of serious things. That's what he believed. He sat down and answered questions politely, carefully. He wanted to be helpful. The officers told him he wasn't a suspect. They said that clearly, more than once. They said they just needed to clear a few things up. He nodded, relaxed his shoulders. He thought he would be home for dinner. The room was small, neutral. Nothing about it felt threatening. No raised voices, no aggression, just patience. Time passed without him noticing. Questions repeated themselves, but slightly differently each time. Small details were revisited, then revisited again. When he corrected them, it was written down. When he hesitated, it was noticed. He didn't understand how that mattered. They showed him timelines, asked him to explain gaps. He did. They asked again. He explained again. At some point, he stopped being sure which version he had already said. They told him evidence existed, not specific evidence, just evidence. They said things would go much easier if he helped them understand what really happened. He didn't realize that helping them now meant agreeing later. Hours passed. He asked if he could leave. They said soon. They asked one more question, then another. Fatigue settled in quietly. He stopped correcting small mistakes. They didn't seem important. He assumed the truth would matter more than precision. He was wrong. At some point, they told him what they believed happened. They didn't say it was final. They said it was a theory. They asked if it sounded right. He said he wasn't sure. They said memory works that way under stress. They said people forget things. They said it was normal. He wanted the conversation to end. He wanted to go home. When they finally asked him to sign the statement, he believed it was procedural. He believed it would all be cleared up later. He didn't realize that the moment he agreed, the story stopped being theirs and became his. When the statement was finished, the tone in the room changed. Not dramatically, subtly. The questions stopped being open. They became specific. They asked him to confirm details he didn't remember saying. Dates, times. They read his words back to him. Slowly, he recognized some of them. Others felt unfamiliar. When he hesitated, they reminded him he had already agreed. They said backing out now would only make things worse. He asked again if he could leave. This time, the answer wasn't clear. They said they still needed to clarify a few points. They said it would only take a moment. The chair felt harder than before, the room smaller. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't slept properly the night before. Fatigue blurred the edges of the conversation. They told him the evidence matched his statement. They didn't show it to him. They said they couldn't. They said it was confidential. They said this was his chance to explain himself. He didn't understand how explaining had turned into defending. When the paper was placed in front of him again, they pointed to a line near the bottom. They said it was just a formality. They said everyone signs it. He noticed his hand shaking as he picked up the pen. He told himself it didn't matter, that it would all be sorted out later. He signed. That was the moment the conversation officially ended. He was told to wait. Minutes passed. Then someone else entered the room. Someone he hadn't seen before. They spoke differently, more carefully. They told him he was being detained. He laughed at first, assuming it was a misunderstanding. They didn't laugh back. They explained the charges calmly, as if reading from a script. The words didn't register immediately. He had just walked in to help. He hadn't planned for this. He asked to see a lawyer. They said he could. Later, he was led out of the room through a different door. The hallway felt longer than it should have. He noticed details he hadn't seen before. Cameras, locks. By the time he reached the holding area, the idea that he could simply explain everything had already started to fall apart. The lawyer arrived hours later, not because anyone rushed to call one, because the process required it. By then, the story had already been written down, signed, filed. The lawyer listened carefully, then quietly. He asked the same questions the investigators had asked earlier, but this time, the answers didn't sound the same. Details shifted. Timelines blurred. The lawyer noticed immediately. He explained, calmly, that consistency mattered now, that changing anything would look suspicious. The words felt unreal. How could correcting a mistake be suspicious? The lawyer didn't answer that directly. He explained how confessions work, how fatigue affects memory, how suggestion becomes agreement. He said it happened more often than people realized. That didn't make it feel better. The confession was presented as voluntary, recorded, signed. There was no footage of the entire conversation, only fragments, enough to show cooperation, not enough to show pressure. The case moved quickly after that. Charges were filed. A court date was set. The media reported the arrest confidently. They used words like breakthrough and key admission. His name appeared everywhere. Friends were confused. Family didn't understand. People who had known him for years struggled to reconcile the image on the screen with the person they knew. But the story was simple. He had confessed. In court, the statement was read aloud. Every word sounded heavier than it had in that room. He barely recognized himself in it. When he tried to explain how it had happened, the explanation sounded weak. Confessions are powerful. They carry more weight than evidence. Jurors were told that people don't admit to crimes they didn't commit. That assumption settled quietly in the room. Experts were mentioned. Procedures referenced. The process appeared clean. By the time doubts were raised, they felt like excuses. And excuses are easy to dismiss when a confession already exists. The trial didn't last long. It didn't need to. The confession did most of the work. Evidence was presented, but it was secondary. It supported the story rather than proving it. Timelines were aligned to the statement. Witness accounts were interpreted through it. Everything pointed in the same direction, because everything was measured against the same assumption. When inconsistencies appeared, they were explained as stress, as memory failure. The jury listened. They took notes. They were told how rare false confessions were. They were told how many safeguards existed. They were told this case was different. He watched as his own words were used against him, words he barely remembered saying. When he tried to explain the pressure, the room felt colder. Pressure is difficult to prove. When it doesn't look like force, there were no threats, no shouting, just time, fatigue, suggestion. The verdict came back quickly. Guilty. The sound of it felt final. Sentencing followed. Years were assigned, not because of what was proven, but because of what was believed. Prison stripped away the last illusion that this was temporary. Days became routine. Routines became years. He replayed the interview constantly. The moment he could have stopped it. The moment he could have asked for help sooner. But regret doesn't change records. Appeals were filed. Denied. The confession stood. Outside, life moved on. Inside, time slowed.